And it is that grace of God, that risk of his own investment into us, by which we can then invest in each other and in the kingdom of God. And that is simply what he is talking about. I have some handouts here. I should pass this out before. That's okay. I had to do the same thing as last night. Again, I hit the print button and I thought I had them correlated. There are 5 pages here. Somebody help me. There we go. These are more primary quotes here. There you go. There you go. I'm going to take 5. Actually, I need one myself. Thank you.
Pass them down. All here. Here, you gave me your yesterday. Oh, my goodness, that's for yesterday.
You need more?
I made 35. I thought we had 33 people here.
It's like, should be 32 people.
What's that?
32.
Oh, okay, so it should be maybe 34 copies.
How about last town?
Does everybody have one? Set? So the remedy that we have to talk about in terms of this fear and this shame is God's grace. Again, grace is really the theme of these 3 women's lives. And when we talk about grace, we again talk about it like this flood of water. Now, in Rome and in Siena and Florence and things like that, they have these fountains along the street, and they're always running. It's from the natural springs that are underneath, especially in Rome. And actually, there's this really cool one over by the Vatican that's the papal tiaras, and they're kind of stacked up, and there's water coming out of all the sides of the tiaras, and you can drink out of it. And you can drink any of the water because it's all fresh water, and it's very delicious, and it's very good, and it's always running. And St. Catherine of Siena, of course, uses this idea to talk about God's grace, and it's always flowing. And if we keep our vessel, which is our heart, underneath that fountain of God's love, it will continually be full. In fact, it will continually be full and continue to overflow. And if we read this first quote here on page 1, it's just the second sentence in the paragraph. Even though you draw your love from God, who is the fountain of living water, if you do not drink it continually in him, your vessel will soon become empty. This is the sign that you are not drinking fully of God. If you suffer pain from the person you love, either because of a conversation you have had, or because you are deprived of some familiar consolation, or because of some accidental cause, if you suffer because of this or become anything else except an offense against God, it is a clear sign that your love is still imperfect, and that you have drawn away from the fountain. In what way then can the imperfect be made perfect? This way, by correcting and chastising the movements of your heart with true self-knowledge, and with the hatred and disgust for your imperfection, seeing that you are so discourteous as to give to the creature the love that ought to belong wholly to God, by loving the creature without moderation, while loving God moderately. For love of God should be pleasureless, and for that the creature should be measured against our love of God, and not by the measure of our own spiritual or temporal consolation. So then do your best to love everyone in God, and correct every inordinate affection. Make 2 homes for yourself, my daughter. One will be your actual cell, which with you keep running all over the place, except when it is necessary. That's her house. Or in obedience to your prioress, or for the sake of charity. The other will be a spiritual home that you carry with you always, the cell of true self-knowledge, where you find within yourself knowledge of God's goodness. This is actually two cells in one. When you are in the one, you need to be in the other too. For otherwise you would fall into either confusion or presumption. For if you had only self-knowledge, you would experience confusion of the mind. And if you only had knowledge of God, you would fall into presumption. The one therefore needs to be seasoned by the other, so that together they may become one and the same thing. If you do this till you reach perfection. Remain in holy, gentle love of God, gentle Jesus, gentle love. When we have the courage to enter into the cell of self-knowledge, and this is really, really important. St. Thomas Aquinas says something that I always quote is, you can't love what you don't know. And because of this thing of shame that we deal with, we try to protect this shame at all costs. None of us really want to see this. But what St. Catherine of Siena says is that if we truly want to keep our vessel underneath the fountain of God's grace, it requires for us to have a great deal of self-knowledge. But self-knowledge also means not only seeing the goodness in us, but also seeing the shame. And you see, this is the tough thing. Let me give you an analogy about how this shame tends to manifest itself in our culture. So, has anybody ever heard the story of the Princess and the Pea?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to change it just a little bit. So you have this king, right? And he's trying to find a wife for his prince, and he wants to make sure that there's no false princesses out there. And of course, princesses are all very, very sensitive, right? And so what he does is he has them stay in the castle for the evening, and he puts them on a bed, and there's a little mattress, and in between the mattresses, of course, he puts a little pea. And when the first princess comes and she sleeps on it, she doesn't feel anything. When the second princess comes and sleeps on it, she doesn't feel anything. But the real princess comes and she lays down on it. I'm not an artist, and apparently she's going to bed in her dress. And she gets very uncomfortable because she's so sensitive to it, and she doesn't know exactly what the problem is. So what she does is she has one of the guards bring in a second mattress. She puts that on top. And she sleeps on top of those two, and she still feels the thing. And all of a sudden, she says to the guard, bring me in another mattress. And so finally, she's sleeping on top of all these mattresses. And still she feels it. She feels the lump from this thing inside of the bed. And what this thing is here, this pea, is this shame that comes directly out of our experience of sin. A lot of people don't really want to do the work in order to push the bed off of the box springs and see what goes on. Rather, what they do is they stack more and more and more things on top of it. And so this shame becomes covered by fear. That's to forget everything and run. We try to bury it. We try to bury those things just like the guy in the parable. And the second level becomes anger. A lot of people that deal with these things get angry. And then finally, all sorts of avoidance. And so we try to bury it, and by the time that we're stacked all of these mattresses on top of each other, we are so high up, and now that we're afraid of heights, and we're completely separated from the people that are down here. And what St. Catherine of Siena is saying here is that if we truly want to have the flood of God's grace, this continual experience of His vessel, we have to start pushing these things away. And to get really down to the bottom of what that is. It's that very thing that should not be there. It's that very thing that separates us from the love of God. And for some people, it is a pea. For some people, it is a giant rock. And depending on where your own history is, your own history with your childhood, with your parents, with your experiences in life, sometimes our shame comes out of guilt. Sometimes it comes out of having something done to us, becoming a victim. And what St. Catherine of Siena says in this quote that I just read you is that we have to have the courage to unearth and to dig up all of the things of our history and our past. Not just the good things, but also the bad things. And we have to have that courage and hope to understand that God's grace will be enough for us to see it. And that there's nothing God will not love, and there's nothing that God will not redeem. And so courage is something that really marks these women's lives because they knew them.